Once you're confident that you have given a book a thorough once-over, that is, you've given it an inspectional reading, determined its parts, and then used those parts to understand and state an author's arguments and propositions in your own words, then it's time to criticize the work. Today we're going to learn how to use intellectual etiquette to criticize a work fairly. Hi there, I'm Linda Maxey, the author of the Library Lend Guides to Superlative Nonfiction Books. We've been making our way chapter by chapter through How to Read a Book, the Classic Guide to Intelligent Reading by Mortimer J. Adler and Charles Van Doren. This is either the 10th or the 11th video in the series, I'm not sure, but for the earlier videos in this series, please check out my playlist below. To review briefly, there are 4 stages of reading according to our authors. You have to master each level from the bottom up, elementary at the bottom, to the top, syntopical. You cannot move to a higher level until you've mastered the one below it. Most of this book is devoted to the 3rd stage of reading, analytical reading. This stage is possibly the most important level to master if you're truly looking to increase not your knowledge, but your understanding of what authors have to teach. This breaks my heart, but it's true. You can't read a good book quickly and gain understanding. You can skim the book if you like. In fact, they recommend doing that to start with. But if you really want to understand what the author is saying, you must read the book slowly, following the steps they outline. Now, analytical reading is the 3rd stage of reading, but in itself, it's composed of 3 separate stages. We've covered the first 2 stages in previous videos, but here's a brief recap. Stage 1 of analytical reading has you breaking down a book into its component parts. Stage 2 has you take those parts and figure out how they're used by the author to create a unified message. You figure out the arguments the author is making to prove a point, and then you figure out what propositions they use to buttress their arguments. So only once you've done those steps are you in a position to decide whether you think the author has been successful, unsuccessful, or if you're not sure. Each of these 3 is a valid response to a book you're evaluating. But if you've read How to Read a Book, or you've been following my videos in this series, you've probably guessed that it's not as simple as just saying, oh yeah, I totally get that, I do agree, or nope, none of that made a bit of sense to me, so the author has proved nothing. No, they don't let you off the hook that easily. So let's get into stage 3 of analytical reading, in which you get to talk back to the author. As with the other stages, this one has several parts. This chapter in the book is chapter 10, Criticizing a Book Fairly, and it covers only the first part of this final stage. But it's a big one. Honestly, I loved this chapter. So let's get into it. They call what they discuss here intellectual etiquette. I had never heard that term before, but I think it's a good thing for everyone to grasp. The first thing you need to understand is that when you read a book, you are entering into a conversation with its author. The author has gone to a great deal of trouble and effort to help you understand the message they want to get across. They say, Adler and Van Doren say, that it's bad manners, a breach of etiquette for us to read a book quickly and just decide based on how we feel about it at the end that it's right, wrong, or even indeterminate. That's just not fair to the author. They say it's the same as when you have a conversation with a real person in front of you. Hopefully, you try to understand what they are saying before you jump in to agree or disagree. Actually, a lot of us don't do this. Sometimes I don't do it myself. It pains me to say this, but I have actually lost friends over arguing against something someone was saying without truly understanding what they were trying to get across. Many of us have forgotten the importance of really listening to others, I think. So this lesson, which I'll discuss in a bit more detail in a bit, is not just good advice for reading books and learning. It's good advice for life. But when it comes to having a conversation with an author, they are not there for you to defend themselves or to point out things they clearly said in their work that you may have glossed over or ignored. So it's unfair to an author, whether they're still living or not, to make pronouncements about their work if you haven't gone to the trouble of being really sure you understand what they were saying. In other words, their intention and effort to teach you should be respected by an equal effort on your part to understand. To me, this is the most important thing I've read in this book so far. They don't think this is optional on your part either. If you've read a good book, they say it's your duty to evaluate it and criticize it fairly. To them, accepting what someone tells you without evaluating it for yourself means you're not exercising your right as a free individual. Now, this is very serious and deep. Think about this. If you just take someone else's word for whatever they are saying, you may as well be their slave intellectually. And I realize that that's not a good metaphor anymore. People don't like that sort of metaphor, but that's the one they used. And I really think it describes it. If you're truly free to have your own thoughts, you're responsible for what you take to be the truth. You don't get to make up your own truth. You don't get to create your own truth. What's real is what they're saying. And you're responsible for what you decide is real. And the way you do that is to think about it and truly figure out whether or not you understand it. So wow, that's pretty big. All right, to do this, you need to first apply intellectual etiquette, which is discussed in this chapter, and then you need to apply specific points of criticism, which they define in the next chapter. We'll cover those in the next video. It's important to understand that criticism, and by criticism, they do not mean tearing a book apart, argument by argument, to prove it wrong. That's what we tend to think criticism is now, disagreement. But criticism in this sense doesn't mean disagreement at all. It just means a well thought out evaluation of a work. A good criticism, according to them, can mean you agree, disagree, or suspend judgment. Any of those are acceptable as long as you apply the first 3 rules that belong to stage 3 of analytical reading. Okay, so here are the rules that belong to the first and second stage of analytical reading. I won't read them or give you time to because I have videos linked on that below. All right, now for stage 3, here's the first rule. Rule number 9. You must be able to say with reasonable certainty, I understand, before you can say any of the following things. I agree, or I disagree, or I suspend judgment. In other words, and I'm quoting them here, do not begin to talk back until you have listened carefully and are sure you understand. And how do you do this? By following the first 2 steps of analytical reading. One of the most important tips for being sure you understand this is to be sure you can state the author's propositions and arguments in your own words. If you can't do this, you don't understand. It's that simple. Now, what about the last option, to suspend judgment? When can you do that fairly? If you followed all the rules and steps to do a complete analytical reading and you still don't understand, it's possible the author has failed in their efforts to get their message across adequately. That does happen sometimes. But they say if a book is written by someone who really does know more about the subject than you do, they should get the benefit of the doubt. But if you really tried and you don't understand what they're trying to say, it's okay to suspend judgment. That's fair to the author and it's fair to you. Who knows, later on, with more knowledge or experience, you may be able to read the work and decide that you agree or disagree. And sometimes we need to do more reading to truly understand. Okay, I'm going to give you some examples that they give from page 145 that they use to make this point. Kant's critique of pure reason without reading his critique of practical reason, or Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations without reading his theory of moral sentiments, or to read the Communist Manifesto and critique it without reading Marx's Capital. They all base the works that came after the more well-known works on these earlier works, and if you don't understand the earlier works, you won't understand the second work, is what they're saying here. Okay, so moving on to Rule 10. Rule 10, when you disagree, do so reasonably and not disputatiously or contentiously. Back when I was in college, I remember reading an article in a popular magazine, and I can't remember which one, on how to win an argument. A lot of people enjoy a good argument. I've always hated them, but I was tired of people running roughshod over my ideas, and I read that article to pick up a few pointers. But I found the article extremely distasteful, and here's why. Because there was no discussion of trying to find out what the truth was, what was right The whole focus was on winning the argument, not whether or not you're right. What good is winning an argument if you are in fact wrong? And people do this all the time, and often they don't care whether they're right or not. They want the satisfaction and the power of winning. That's no way to live, in my opinion. And it really does come down to that, doesn't it? How do you want to live? Do you want to win at any cost, or do you want to be honest and live by the truth? Now, they admit that few things are absolutely indisputably true. And with our exponential growth in knowledge, it can be so easy to get sidetracked by facts that you miss the essential points that are being argued about. To me, this is the great value of reading of this sort. It helps you get to the crux of matters and not to waste your time on trivia. Why do you think the way you do? Is there a better way to think? And that's what they're talking about here ultimately, I think. But they say to be fair to other people, you need to approach conversations with the idea that you can agree. If you don't, you aren't being fair to the other person. You don't have to agree, but if you want someone to see your point, you have to be able to see their point as well. That's respect. And I love this quote from page 146, and they're talking about books. A bone can always be found to pick a quarrel over. It makes no difference whether the bone is really a chip on your own shoulder. Think about this. They say if you are reading only to pick out flaws in arguments, the problem is emotional rather than intellectual. Ooh, that stings. Okay, and the final rule in this lesson, Rule 11. Respect the difference between knowledge and mere personal opinion by giving reasons for any critical judgment you make. They say one way to do this is to always approach a disagreement as a problem that can be resolved. Not that will be resolved, but can be. That's a charitable way of approaching it, and it's more likely to uncover the truth. Many disagreements are built on misunderstandings. And this reminded me of a 3-hour and 21-minute conversation that I will link below between Sir Ian McGilchrist, John Veracke, and Daniel Schmachtenberger. They were discussing how humanity can find its way out of this polarized, ineffective, and possibly deadly morass that we've been caught up in. It was a pretty important conversation. All three are brilliant men and very well respected. If you have the time and the patience, I really recommend listening to it. But the conversation also struck me as a brilliant example of what Adler and Van Doren are talking about here. At various points in the conversation, the three of them did disagree, or at least two of them would disagree. But in most cases, they stopped to figure out how each man was defining their terms or their concepts. And in almost all cases, once they understood how the other was defining things, the problem resolved and the conversation could continue. It's quite common for people less educated on a topic to disagree with people who are more educated. That makes sense. They're not coming from the same background. But if they're willing to be taught, they can often see that their original position was based on misunderstandings or false information and needs to be adjusted. Inequality is curable by instruction, is what our authors have to say about this sort of thing. Opinions and facts should not be confused. I think this is largely forgotten today. I firmly believe that people have a right to their opinions. But if everyone goes through life hanging on to their opinions, unable to take in new information and to be taught by those who truly have a better understanding of the facts or better access to the facts, we're destined for a miserable future. I hope it's clear why I'm a fan of this chapter. They get to the heart of why reading and learning matters here, and they've helped me understand why I have such a passion for both. What do you think about this? There's a lot to reflect on here. Leave any thoughts you have below. So that's it for today. The next lesson in this series will discuss Chapter 11, Agreeing or Disagreeing with an Author. Do you analyze books you read as you go so that you can make informed criticisms? Reading this book has helped me see that I've been a pretty lazy reader all too often, and I don't do that. For more great nonfiction books to read, I recommend my books. Library Lynn's curated collection of superlative nonfiction, and Library Lynn's biographies, autobiographies, and memoirs. I also have a good collection of books on subject-specific blogs on my website, librarylynn.com, which is linked below. So until next time, Happy reading.